Hi and welcome to this video where we cover the Tour of Heroes tutorial, which is basically the fundamentals of Angular. So by the end of this video, you'll have followed the tutorial with me and you'll have learned pretty much everything you need to know to get up and running with Angular and create your own Angular applications. So as you can see, we build this sort of dashboard view at the start. We click into a hero, we see some details. We also have a master list view of the various heroes like we can see here. So essentially we have a small app, but there's quite a few moving parts. And as you can see, when we update a hero as an example and hit back, that is persisted on the other route. So I hope you find this video useful. Let's jump into the first section here, the application shell. So using the Angular CLI, we'll essentially be setting up our environment, creating a new workspace and initial app project, serving that in the browser, and then looking to make changes to that application. The first part here of this tutorial is looking at creating a new workspace. So let's go ahead and do that. We need to run ng new Angular Tour of Heroes, but you'll need the Angular CLI installed prior to that. So we can click install the Angular CLI, and that will allow us to install the Angular CLI like so. You'll also need to make sure that you have Node.js 8 or 10, just at least 8 would be fine, but I usually run sort of the latest version of Node. So inside of your terminal, go ahead and type npm install @angular/cli-g. This will install the Angular CLI globally on your machine. I've already done this, so I won't need to do it on this machine. Next up, we can go ahead and run that command, ng new Angular Tour of Heroes. So let's copy that, and we can straight up paste that inside of the shell. And what this will do is go ahead and create a new Angular application using the CLI that we've just installed. Right now, I imagine we don't want to add Angular routing, so let's hit no for that. We also want to use SCSS. You can select any style sheet format that you want, then hit enter. This will now go ahead and create the Angular application for us. Once that has completed, we can cd into Angular Tour of Heroes, and then we can open this up inside of Visual Studio Code or an editor of your choice. And then at the same time, we can run ng serve -- open. Awesome. We can now see that we have the Tour of Heroes here on screen and our project, which has everything inside of source. As we can see, we have things like the app directory, assets, environments, and much more. For now, I'll keep things simple and we'll just take a look at the app component.html. And this is essentially our app components template. So this is exactly what we see, the HTML that we write as an example, here on screen. Now, if you're new to Angular, you may have seen things like this before, or you may never have seen it before. This is how we bind to an item inside of our component. So for example, we have this property title here. If we want to bind to that value and display it on screen, well, we can go ahead and look inside of the app component, and we can see that we have this title, which is called Angular Tour of Heroes. And just like the Tour of Heroes tutorial says, we can go ahead and change this to be Tour of Heroes. And once we hit save, this will update our application automatically. And that's because those double braces that we just saw there, that's what's known as the interpolation binding syntax. Essentially what's happening at this point is it takes the title property, gets the value of that, and then displays it inside of these braces. You can actually do anything you want here, so we could say to uppercase, and that will allow us to say, welcome to Tour of Heroes, everything being uppercase. So we are able to use JavaScript inside of this interpolation binding. So if we open up using Command B, and we see that we have this app component.scss, the app component.ts, and the app component.html. These are what's known as the application shell. This app component is the first component that gets loaded when we open up our project. And we'll look at why in the future, and that's related to the app module and the way that we bootstrap this app component. But I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves too much. That just sort of gives you an idea of how this app component is being displayed on screen. And then of course you can see that we are binding the template URL and style URLs inside of this component metadata, which once again, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but That's how it's associating the app component HTML and app component SCSS templates to this JavaScript or TypeScript component. Let's go ahead and open up the app component.scss and paste in the styles from, of course, the tutorial. We'll also remove everything out of app component and just simply put the title inside of a H1 like so. So in this section, we learned about the initial application structure using the Angular CLI. We also looked at how to display data using Angular components, and we also looked at this interpolation syntax to bind a property inside of our component here on screen. Next up, we're going to look at how to display hero information and place that component inside of our app shell. So pull up your terminal and type ng generate component heroes. And what this does, it uses the Angular CLI to generate a new component called heroes. And as you can see, it creates 4 different files. It creates a style file, a HTML file, a spec file, and that's for running our tests, and a component file. It also at the same time updates the app-module.ts. And if we take a look at app-module.ts, you can start to get an idea that when we add these new components, it's adding it to this declarations array. Once again, we don't want to worry too much about app module yet because we're not there, but essentially what you can see from this is that we're using the CLI to generate components. We don't have to make these components ourselves. Let's head over to our heroes.component.ts. So starting at line 1, we have this import of component and onInit from Angular core. So the component here is what's known as a decorator, and that allows us to provide metadata about this component, and that allows Angular to generate a particular component. So starting by looking at this component here, we can see the at component is what's known as a decorator, and that allows us to specify particular metadata about this component, such as the selector, that's the CSS element selector. That essentially means that inside of our HTML, we can say something like app-heroes, and then that will of course appear on screen. We then have the template URL, and that's the location of the template URL. So as you can see here, heroes.component.html. If we look at that, we can see it right here. And then the same goes for the style URLs. So we can supply multiple different style URLs, hence why we have an array at this point. For now, it just generates 1, and for most times, you'll simply just have 1. Moving down to the export class syntax, you can see that we are exporting this. If we didn't export this class, then other areas of our application wouldn't be able to import it. So it is definitely important that we export it. We then have this implementation of onInit, and this looks at a lifecycle hook. Essentially what this does is when the application launches, each component has a lifecycle hook. So when this component is initialized, as we can see here, a lifecycle hook that is called after Angular has initialized all data-bound properties of a directive or component in this circumstance. It then goes ahead and calls anything that's inside of this ng onInit. So this is a really good time if you've got any sort of initialization sort of functionality that you want to call, then I would definitely do it inside of ng onInit. So that's effectively all you need to know about a component. All it is a class that at the moment implements this interface, but we don't have to do that. We could, for example, remove that, and it will be even smaller. It's essentially just a class with some metadata, and the metadata just shows where the different, for example, files are, style URLs, the selector inside of the DOM, and so on. We'll go ahead and undo that change, and next we'll look at adding a hero. So let's now add a property. We'll say hero is equal to windstorm. And when we save the file, nothing happens because of course we have nothing inside of the template showing that hero. So let's simply replace the paragraph with hero. That's going to bind to that windstorm. Once again, we aren't displaying this component inside of our app component. So we can navigate over to the app component.html and we can say app-heroes. When we do that and hit save, we should see windstorm. And the reason that this works is that the app-heroes is that element selector inside of our heroes component. As well as that, inside of our app module, we're defining this heroes component inside of the declarations. Now we need to define a class to represent our hero. Inside of the app folder, go ahead and create a new file called hero.ts. And inside of here, we want to export a class called hero. We'll say that this has an ID, which is a number, and a name, which is a string. This allows us to statically type our heroes. We're able to say that, hey, whenever we add a new hero, it must have an ID and it must have a name. Let's now navigate over to our heroes component. And inside of here, we want to say that the hero is of type hero. And that's done by importing hero, like so. And we can set the value of that to have the ID of 1 and the name of Windstorm. This now makes it so that we have an object which has an ID of 1 and a name of Windstorm, but as you can see on the page right now, it no longer displays that hero's name. It simply displays object. Let's go back over to our heroes component.html and we'll change this to now have a h2, which says hero.name details. And instantly we can see we now have Windstorm details. Then we can have a div with a span of an ID. And then after that, we can say hero.id. And we can copy this to say name and then hero.name. When we save the file, you can now see that we have this Windstorm details of ID of 1 and name of Windstorm. Once again, we're using this template binding syntax to bind to that particular hero. And next up, we're going to look at how to use a pipe to format the way that the hero's name looks. So by default, Angular comes with a few pipes, one of which happens to be the uppercase pipe. After the name, go ahead and use the pipe operator. It looks something like this. It's the straight line pipe. And then type uppercase. When we hit save, you'll notice that Windstorm becomes capital. So why exactly and how is this happening? Well, it's calling the two uppercase like before, but it's doing it in a different way. When we create a pipe, it has what's known as a transform function, and it passes whatever we pipe into it, which at this moment is the hero.name, and then it returns a new version of the hero.name, but this time with the transform associated to that, and that's of course the uppercase pipe. You'll also be glad to know that it doesn't change the hero name itself, and that's why the binding for the Windstorm up at the top here hasn't changed. So there's a variety of other pipes that you can use out of the box with Angular that have things like formatting strings, currency amounts, dates, and much more. You can also create your own pipes if you want to, and that will allow you to format strings or whatever else you need to do in a more custom way. Next up, we want to look at ng model and ways in which we can edit the name of a particular hero. This will be done with two-way binding, and that's the two-way binding syntax ng model, and we'll look at that just now. So what we need to do is, instead of at the moment just displaying the hero's name, we can change the span to be a label, and after the label, we can go ahead and pass an input with the placeholder of name, and then we want a bracket, and inside of the bracket we want a parentheses, and then we'll say ng model. We'll set that equal to the hero.name. Let's hit save and see what happens. Well, as soon as we do that, we have a white screen, and that's because we haven't imported what's known as the forms module. If we take a look in our console, you can see that it says that we can't bind to ng model since it isn't a known property of input. And this essentially means that ng model doesn't exist on the input property by default, or rather the input element. So what we need to do at this point is head back over to our app.module.ts. And as we've sort of alluded to before, this app module sort of determines how our application is fit together. This allows us to determine which other areas of Angular we may want to import, and then in the future we'll create our own modules, which will essentially be like this app module, but each module will only be able to say what they need. So instead of maybe importing something that only one tiny part of the application needs, we can segregate that over to that part of the application and only have that module import what you need. That may not make sense right now, but that's fine. We'll see this as we start to import the forms module inside of this imports array. So let's add forms module. Then at the top, we can take from import Angular/forms, and we'll want that forms module, and that will allow us to, of course, access ng model. And once we save the file, you'll notice our application does come back to life. So hopefully this is starting to make a little bit more sense. When we import the forms module, we now get access to ng model, and that ng model allows us to listen on a two-way binding to the value of hero.name. And you'll see exactly this when we come to change the name of our hero. For example, let's call our hero Ragnaros. Once we do that, the hero has been updated by default, and instantly you can see the results of that. Just to quickly go over how exactly that works, that's because we're listening to the value of hero.name, and inside of our input right here, we are listening on this input to the value of hero.name, and anytime that value is changed, we're of course updating that value, and then this updates the details like so. Of course, the values aren't persisted because anytime we save the file or refresh, the heroes.component.ts is setting that value to be windstorm. So you may find that any changes you make at this point aren't persisted, and that's normal. So looking at our app module just once more, we can see that of course when we made that new component with the Angular CLI, it was added to this declarations. So as you can see, when we look at declarations, we can see the set of components, directives, and pipes that belong to this module. Declarables, so something like the component right here, it only must belong to exactly one module. So when we come to create multiple modules in the future, maybe we have something like a heroes module, we can't have the heroes component be part of the app module and the heroes module. We'd most likely just want the heroes component to be part of that heroes module. Don't worry about that too much right now, but essentially that's just anytime we create a new component, we need to add it to declarations like this. So in this section, we use the CLI to create a second heroes component. We displayed that heroes component on screen by adding it to our app component. We added the uppercase pipe to format the name of a particular hero. We also looked at two-way data binding using ng model. We discussed the app module, which we can see here. We also imported the forms module to give us access to that ng model directive. And we also looked at how we can declare a new component, and by doing so, we need to only declare it once inside of either the app module or a feature module. Next up, we're going to be displaying heroes inside of a list. So inside of the source app folder, let's go ahead now and create what's known as a mock heroes. So mock-heroes.ts. Just to make life a little easier, we're going to copy paste this from the tutorial itself. I will go over it so you don't need to worry too much about what exactly we're doing here. Essentially, we're importing the hero, and that just allows us to ensure that we have particular types. This means we can't go and add something new, such as age 22. We will get an error because that doesn't match the hero type. So let's remove that. And then we're exporting this heroes here, which is an array, of course, of type hero array. And each object inside of that heroes array has an ID and a name which matches our type. If you have used JavaScript or TypeScript before in any detail, you'll have most likely seen something like this before. So with that in mind, we'll look at displaying these heroes on the page. So inside of our heroes component now, make sure we save this file, we can head over to the hero, and instead say heroes, because there's going to be multiple, is equal to heroes all capitals. We'll need to import that from our mock heroes, and we will get an error at this point because we can no longer display the name of the hero, because now we have a list of heroes, we don't just have one object. Of course, in the DOM, inside of our heroes component.html, we could say something like hero0.name, or rather heroes0.name, because now we've changed the name of our variable. like so. And we would then see Mr. Nice, but what we want to do is display all of these heroes on screen. That allows us to, of course, see them, and the way that we do that is with something called ng4. So let's make some changes to our heroes component. What we'll do is remove everything, and we'll say h2 my heroes, and inside of here we'll have a ul and an li. This is simply an unordered list and some list items. We'll give the ul the class of heroes, and the list item we'll say right here has a span that has a class of badge. Inside of the span we'll have a hero.id, and outside of the span we'll have a hero.name. And we just saw a moment ago that by doing this it's not going to work because we don't have this hero variable. So how do we fix that? Well, we add ng4. So inside of this li, add an asterisk, then ng4, just like that. We'll say equal to let, so this creates a new variable called hero of heroes. This let hero allows us to reference each individual item and bind it to the screen. So when we say hero.id, that's every single hero inside of our heroes array, and per each individual hero, it will display a different ID and a different name. Let's hit save, and we should see all of our heroes here on screen. So what ng4 does is it takes each element that we put the ng4 on, and it repeats that for each element inside of the list. So it'll say if we had 3 items in the list, it would display it 3 times. Otherwise, it just goes up to n being the length of the list. Sometimes you may find that you forget the asterisk here, and that will not work. So you definitely need the asterisk at this point. Just something that you have to keep in mind as you start getting used to Angular. So once we save the file, we can move on to now looking at a master detail view. So in order to determine a master detail view, the first one starts by determining which hero has been clicked. So that allows us to register a click handler, and then we get the ID of whatever has been clicked, and then display information about that hero. So on our li, we can add what's known as a click handler. That's done with these parentheses, and we can say click equals on select hero. So the onSelect method doesn't exist. We're going to create that in a second. And then what we pass through here, this hero, is of course each hero inside of our ng4. So although this hero is not below like our hero.id and hero.name, it will be passed in as a parameter here to this onSelect method. So save it, and let's head over to the heroes component.ts. Let's now make what's known as a selected hero of type hero. We'll need to import hero once again if we've removed that. And then we can make the onSelect function, which takes in a hero, like so. And then the hero itself says this .selected hero is equal to hero. We can even, if we want to, console.log this .selected hero. And now if we check our console and we select Mr. Nice, we can see we have ID of 11 and name of Mr. Nice. Same for Dr. IQ, like so. Now it's about displaying this information here on screen. Well, now that we have the selected hero, this should be quite easy. So we can head over to heroes component.html, and all we need to do is effectively take the previous code that we have before, and we want to say selected hero.name. So as you can see right now, it's going to give us an error inside of the console, and that's because there currently isn't a selected hero. Once we select that hero, it does update, but we don't really want to display this information such as ID. And we also don't want this error inside of the console. And that's essentially what's happening, is because the selected hero doesn't exist at this point. We're trying to display this information, but without any selected hero, it's of course going to fail. Once we give the selected hero a value, that's going to update. And the way that we fix this is by using something called ngIf. Let's wrap this here inside of a div. And then inside of the div, we can say asterisk ngF equals selected hero. What this is essentially doing is saying if there is a selected hero, for example, this value is not null, then display the details. If not, Angular will simply just ignore this. Hit save. Now we no longer have the error inside of the console. We can confirm that if we clear the console, but if we select Tornado, we can see the details about Tornado. So essentially what's happening here is that the selected hero is not defined by default. Angular checks this and makes sure that this is removed from the DOM, but when the value is selected, Angular can then add this back to the DOM because it's essentially listening on this value and waiting for the value to potentially change. Once it does, we have this details page. I'm just going to copy something that I should have probably added earlier, and that's simply the styles, and you can find this inside of the part 2 part of the Tour of Heroes tutorial. If we save that, you can see we now have some different styles for our heroes. Makes no difference as far as Angular is concerned, but it just makes things a little nicer. The problem is, at this point, is that when we select a hero, there's no easy way to determine which hero we've selected. Sure, we can see the details about the hero at the top, but the list should probably change. Angular makes this really easy with something called class binding that allows us to add or remove a CSS class conditionally, and the way that we do that is by heading back over to our heroes component.html, and for our list item we can add these 2 brackets that allows us to bind to the class.selected, and then when we say equals, we can give it essentially the sort of checker, the boolean for this selected class, and we can say we want to add the selected class whenever hero is equal to the selected hero. And the value of hero comes from that ng4 that we created earlier, and once we hit save, we should then be able to select someone like Narco or Mr. Nice, and then we can see that it updates the selected class on this particular list item. So this is the end of part 2, and this essentially allows us to now see a list of heroes in this sort of master detail view, as we call it. As well as that, we can select a hero. We can also use ng4 to iterate over the heroes list. We're using ngIf to conditionally display some information about the hero. And finally, we're binding to this class.selected. And that allows us to, of course, bind to a particular value based on the value of selected hero, i.e. at this point we have the class selected being added whenever the selected hero matches the hero. But we do have a problem at this point, and that's because this heroes component almost does too much. What we want to do is split up large components like this into smaller sub-components, each component then focusing on a particular task or workflow. Let's take some time to create a HeroDetail component. Once again, we can use the Angular CLI to do this. Let's do ng generate component hero-detail. Hit enter. This will go ahead and create the HeroDetail component, as well as update the app module.ts. Let's head over to the HeroDetail template that's inside of the HeroDetail component.html, and we'll paste in what the template should look like. Starting from the top, we're checking to see whether we have a hero. If we do, we're displaying information about that hero. And then of course, we're binding to the hero.name inside of an input like before. But at this point, we don't actually have a way to pass in the value of hero into this component. And that's going to be done with the input. So let's head over to our HeroDetail component.ts, and then we'll import our hero symbol like before. As well as that, from Angular core, as well as component and on init, we'll also need input. Then we can use the input decorator, and we can say the input decorator hero of type hero. That allows us to pass a hero into this component. Then of course, when we do pass the hero in, the hero will be recognized here inside of the template and display the information. We don't need to have any sort of logic inside of our HeroDetail component itself. All we want to do is display some HTML based off that hero. That means we can navigate back over to our heroes.component.html. We can remove the if for the selected hero. So we simply just have this unordered list. And then underneath the unordered list, we can paste in our app HeroDetail. And then when we use this bracket syntax here, that allows us to bind on the value of hero. It's a one-way data binding. And then the selected hero, i.e. the person we select, is then mapped to the value of our HeroDetail component. So this hero right here. Let's save and then select a hero. And once we do that, you can see that the HeroDetails appears here on screen. Once again, that's because the hero has changed inside of our heroes component. We're then passing the value of that hero into the HeroDetail, and then the HeroDetail itself is simply just displaying that information on screen. So this has been a quite small part of the tutorial, and all it is been creating a reusable HeroDetail component. We also looked at how we can use property binding to give the parent heroes component control over that child component, which is the HeroDetail component. At the same time, we added an input decorator to make that hero property available so that we could bind to the value of that here inside of the heroes component. At the moment, our application is doing pretty well, but we could definitely improve this. One way in which we could improve this is by making the hero component do much less work. An example of this is how we're using heroes equal to heroes. What we want to do is delegate this off to a service. And we'll look at how we can do that, starting with the Angular CLI. Once again, open up your terminal inside of our folder and say ng generate service hero. This will generate a service class. Let's open it up. As we see, we have this hero.service.ts. It looks similar to what we've seen with a component, but instead of component, we have this thing called injectable. Essentially, at its heart, this injectable decorator allows Angular to import, or what's known as dependency injection. Essentially, this injectable decorator at this point allows us to inject this hero service throughout our application. So by delegating off this hero service to allow us to get the data from somewhere, the component doesn't have to care about where the data comes from. It can simply just call a method called getHeroes as an example, and the service can be responsible for giving the component the heroes. If the implementation of getHeroes changes, the component doesn't care. Let's go ahead and make a new method that simply returns the mock heroes. So we'll need to import the heroes from the mock heroes folder and the hero class. Then inside of a hero service, we can say get heroes. That's going to be of type hero array, and it will simply just return heroes. Now, in order to use a service throughout the Angular application, you'll need to do something called provide the hero service. Now, by default, when we generate a service using the Angular CLI, we have this provided in root. And what this does is it allows the service to be used as a singleton throughout the application. So we essentially have a single shared instance of this hero service, and anything that wants to use the hero service will get that same instance. Let's navigate over to our heroes component.ts, and what we'll need to do is here at the top, import the hero service from /hero.service. Heroes can now essentially just have a hero array as a type, and then we'll have to inject the hero service inside of the constructor. So we'll say private hero service of type hero service. What this does is then Angular is able to inject that hero service into this component. We don't have to create a new instance of it because Angular is handling all of that for us. We simply just have access to this service, which we can create, for example, a get heroes function. And inside of the function, we can set this.heroes equal to this.heroService.getHeroes. So this gives us effectively what we had before. We have this list of heroes, but now the component doesn't care how it gets the information, it just gets it from this getHeroes function. It's currently best practice to do any initialization code inside of ng on init, so we can say this.getHeroes, And when we save the file, we'll have almost, or rather the identical application as we had before, because we have the same list of heroes and we are displaying them here on screen. But life isn't always as easy as this. Right now, what we're doing is we have this heroes, but that's a synchronous call to a fake list of data. And in the real world, most likely we will be using asynchronous calls, and these will often be real heroes. So how do we do that? We can either use something like a promise or an observable. Now Angular is tightly tied to observables, and observables give us a great pattern which allow us to take data out of a stream. We don't necessarily need to care about where the data comes from once again. We just get back that stream, we can subscribe and listen to that stream, and then get our heroes once again. So if you've never used RxJS and observables before, this may be a little intimidating to start with, but let's dive in to our hero.service.ts. And now instead of only returning the heroes, we want to return an observable list of heroes. Let's start by importing from RxJS, and we want observable and of. Instead of returning heroes, we can say we want to return of heroes. And once we do that, you'll see we have this red underline. And that's because we are now returning an observable of heroes. So we need to change our type signature here and say observable of a hero array. When we do that, our application will break, our heroes will no longer be displayed on screen, because now what's happening is we have this observable stream of heroes, and the first sort of item, or rather the single emitted value at this point, is this array of heroes, but we aren't actually listening for the stream. So back over to our heroes.component.ts, and you can see now we need to remove this call to, or rather assignment to this.heroes, and instead we want to call that function which returns us that observable, and then subscribe to that observable here. We then get back a list of heroes inside of what's known as the observer, which we can then assign our this.heroes equal to heroes. Once we save the file, we have exactly like we had before. The benefit this time though is that this new version waits for the observable to emit the array of heroes. This could happen instantly, or it could happen several minutes from now. This means that as we're subscribing to these heroes, we aren't locking up the UI while we wait for the server's response. This asynchronous approach is much better than simply trying to get these heroes synchronously. We're now going to generate a messages component that will allow us to display app messages at the bottom of the screen, as well as create another messages service, inject that into the hero service, and then display a message whenever the hero service fetches the new heroes. So let's start off by creating the messages component with the CLI. Let's type ng generate component messages. Once again, this will create our 4 component files. It will then update the app module with the new messages component. We can see that inside of the declarations when we hit appmodule.ts. Inside of our app component.html, we can now go ahead and show the app messages. When we do that, we should see messages works like this on screen. Next, we'll create the service with the Angular CLI once more. So let's say ng generate service message. If we open up our message service, we have a very familiar look, similar to the previous service. And this time we want to have a messages string. That's going to be a string array equal to an empty array to start with. And all we want is an add, which will be a message, and that's simply going to be a string, and it will push onto the messages list like so. And we'll also have a clear, which will set the list of messages equal to an empty array. We can now navigate back over to our HeroService.ts, and inside of the constructor, we want to say private message service, and we'll type that to our message service. Make sure you also import the message service as well. Once we save the file, this will now be injected into the service. When we get the heroes, we want to add a message to the message service. So let's say this .message service .add. We want to say hero service fetched heroes. This is good, but at the moment we aren't displaying these messages inside of the component. So we need to head over to the messages.component.ts, and inside of the constructor, we'll say public message service of type message service. And why is this one public and not private? Well, whenever we make something public inside of this constructor here, we're able to bind it inside of our template. When we say private, we can't bind it inside of the template. Inside of our messages component, make sure you save that file, we'll head over to the messages component.html, and we'll paste in just this simple template that allows us to see the heroes messages. As we can see, we have the hero service fetched heroes. We also have the ability to clear the messages. If we click clear, it all disappears, and that's because we're only displaying this messages right here if the message service.messages.length is greater than 0. And that's once again possible because we're binding directly to this service as it's public. And if we look inside of the message service, it has these two public methods that allows us to obviously either add, clear, or simply bind to this messages string array. So at the end of this part, the part 4 of the tour of heroes, we've refactored the data access to the hero service class. We registered the hero service as a provider, and we did that at a root level so that can be imported anywhere inside of the application. We also looked at the dependency injection to inject various things. At the moment we're injecting a service. We looked at observables and understanding at how we can subscribe to these observables, as well as things like the ng on a net lifecycle hook, and as well as ways in which we can communicate between classes using things like our message service. Next up is the good fun of routing, and we'll be having a look at that in this next section. So we want to have the ability to add a dashboard view. We want to be able to navigate between heroes and dashboard views, and whenever somebody clicks a hero name in either of the views, we want to navigate to a detail view of that selected hero. And finally, when we select a deep link, for example in an email or on a website, we want to be able to open the detail view for that hero. That's all coming up now when we start developing and creating this new module. So we want to be inside of our CLI, and we want to say ng generate module. We'll call this module the app-routing. We'll pass it the flat flag, and that will simply put it inside of the source/app folder instead of making it inside of its own folder. And we'll also say --module is equal to app, and that will register it inside of the imports array inside of our app module. Let's hit enter. When we do that, it should go ahead and create that new module. So we have this app-routing.module, and it's also updated over at our app-module.ts. We can see we have this app routing module. Let's open up that app routing module just to see it. So this is how we start talking about different modules that we have and how we can make things a feature module, how we can import things in one particular module but not another. So we don't need to declare any components inside of our routing module. What we want to do is export the router module itself. So that's done by importing from @angular/router. We want the router module, and we also want routes. By exporting the router module, that will allow other components inside of our app module to access things inside of the router module. That's things like the router link, which we'll see very shortly. So we can start by defining some routes. We'll say const routes is of type routes, and that's an array. We'll say that they have a new object with the path of heroes, and then we have a component equal to the heroes component. So we'll need to import that component, and as you may be able to tell, what we're starting to do now is make the routes inside of our application that correspond to a particular component. So when we navigate to localhost 4200/heroes, we'll be given that heroes component. Inside of our app module, we can now go ahead like so. Inside of our imports, we can go ahead now and say router module dot for route and pass through those routes. At the moment, we just have one route. Let's now go over to the app component.html, and where we have app heroes, replace that with the router outlet. So you'll notice that our application has now disappeared. But at the top here inside of our address bar, if we go to /heroes and hit enter, you'll see that our heroes appears on screen. Not exactly great. So not exactly how we want to navigate to that page. So underneath the title, let's make a new nav, and we'll use something called the router link directive. And when we say /heroes, this will take the user whenever they select heroes to that route. So let's select heroes, and then you can of course see the heroes here on screen. Next up, let's create a dashboard. That means going over to our CLI and typing ng generate component dashboard. As we've come to expect, it's going to create the 4 files and update our app module.ts. Inside of the dashboard, we can go ahead and replace the content in these 3 files that we get from the tutorial, and that starts off with the dashboard component.html. All this is simply just iterating over each one of our heroes and displaying that here on screen. Our dashboard component at this moment in time just simply gets access to those heroes once again. And finally, we want to go over now to the dashboard component.scss and save the file. That will give us access to the style sheet. Inside of our app routing, we want to go ahead and add a route for this dashboard. So let's add another item. This time we'll say path equals to dashboard and the component equal to dashboard component. Make sure you import that once again. But we don't want to have to keep navigating towards this component. We want to add what's known as a default route. So let's add a default route above all of these with a path of nothing. And we'll say we want to redirect to /dashboard, and the path match should be full. So whenever the path is dashboard, it will navigate us over to the dashboard. So let's go back to the default, and we can see now we have here top heroes. Because these 2 items here are above the router outlet, that's why they continue to display on screen. So if we look inside of our app component.html, we have the title, we have the nav, and then we have the router outlet. So anything inside of this router outlet, for example, when we select heroes, is replaced, and then we can see the results of that on screen. Let's add a link now to that dashboard. So now we can navigate back and forward between the 2 items. We have the dashboard and we have the heroes. Let's now make it so that we can navigate to the hero details. Starting off inside of our app routing module, we have this new path that we can create. And that's going to be the path of detail/:ID. And the :ID is what's known as a parameterized route. And that's essentially going to say if this matches the pattern, for example, the detail, then /an ID, and that ID can be anything, then we want to display the HeroDetail component. So let's say component, HeroDetail component. We can update our dashboard component. So if we head over to our dashboard component.html, we can change our A to use that router link to /detail/HeroID. Now whenever we select a hero such as Narco, we're taken to detail/12, and that's because that's the ID of Narco. Same for Magenta, and so on. In our heroes component.html, we currently have an onSelect, and that's how we're displaying information on screen about that hero. But instead what we want to do is add a router link to a detail page. So go ahead and remove that click event here. We can also go ahead and remove this class.selected because we're no longer concerned about whether the class is selected or not. And now inside of our span, or rather above that span, we can make an A tag with the router link equal to /detail/hero.id. and inside of that A tag, we can have that span. That means we need to update our heroes component.scss. So I'm going to paste in the new styles, and that's from, of course, the part 5 of this tutorial. So while our heroes component still works, at the moment we aren't displaying any detail inside of this HeroDetail component yet, we aren't making use of things like this onSelect method. So let's simply remove that. And then we also don't have a selected hero, so we can remove that as well. Our application will remain just the same. Now let's look inside of our HeroDetail component. What we want to do at this moment is inject, or rather import, the activated route and the location. We also want that HeroService, so let's add that too. And then inside of the constructor, we can go ahead and inject each one of these things. So we'll say private route, activated route, private HeroService, and finally private location. So the activated route, what that does is it holds information about the route to the instance of this HeroDetail component. So for example, when we select a hero with the ID of 21, that will give us the ability to get the hero based on this ID. Our HeroService, of course, as we know, allows us to get that information from a server, or at the moment just from the file system. And then location can be used to, of course, navigate backwards and forwards and interact with the browser. Let's now make a getHero inside of this component. I'll return a void, and we'll say const ID is equal to this.route.snapshot.parammap.get ID. That's going to give us the ID back, but that's going to be a string. So we'll need to put a plus before this, and that will convert that to a number. And then based on that ID, we'll say this.HeroService.getHero. We'll pass through an ID, and then we'll subscribe to that. We'll get back that hero, and we'll set this.hero equal to hero. We have a problem at the moment because we haven't actually created this, of course, getHero method. So let's go ahead and make that. That'll be inside of our hero.service.ts. We can make a getHero based on an ID, which is a number. That's going to return us an observable of hero, because it's going to be an individual hero. We can use our message service, or just copy this, and we'll say fetched hero with ID, and then we'll bind to that ID. This is what's known as a template binding, and that's done with this backtick here. And finally, we'll return an of, which is essentially just an observable of heroes.find, and we want to find where the hero matches that ID. Finally, let's now remove hero from being an input to simply being defined here on the component. That means we no longer need this HeroDetail inside of our heroes component. And then if we save the file, and inside of our HeroDetail component here, we call the this.getHero. Then if we go back to dashboard and we select a hero such as Bombasto, Narco, or anybody else, we'll see information about that hero. We also have this messages here inside of our messages service, and then we can see HeroService fetched ID 12. Inside of our detail page, there's one last thing to do, and that's simply to add a button, and we'll call the go back function. So that's inside of our HeroDetail component, and we just need to make a quick function called go back. That's going to return void, and it's simply just going to say this.location.back. Once we now select back, it takes us back in our application. So we can go ahead and select a variety of different heroes, like so. So we added the Angular router to navigate across different components. We also looked at the app component being turned into a navigation shell with the A-links and the router outlet. We also configured the router in the app routing module. We defined some routes. We used the router link, and we also, at the same time, used the HeroService across multiple components. So we're nearly done. What we need to do now is go ahead and use the HTTP. This HTTP client is going to allow us to get hero data with HTTP requests. And because this video is getting a little long and sort of HTTP comes under what I would consider extra functionality, I'm going to show that inside of a new video coming up on the channel. So if you've liked this, let me know inside of the comment section below. I appreciate this has been a longer one. Don't worry, it's been a long one for me as well. Simply go backwards, forwards, follow this tutorial if you're new to Angular. Hopefully you'll find out that by the end of it, you sort of understand how each one of the components work together. I'd love to have your feedback in the comments and let me know what you think of this style of video. If you want me to create more videos like this, let me know. Less videos like this, let me know too. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you soon.